nothing is clear. I'm giving away my deepest of fears. Giving to nothing, give to be strong, give to the unknown. No, nothing is wrong. All is alright, alright in time. Into the night, fires burn bright. Into the day and into the night, we grow the deeper I see in your eyes. The tears that I cry, tears that I weep, they have me falling, falling asleep. Oh, trees burning, the wind's picking up, sun's going down, and I'm feeling a rush. We're going insane. Staying a while, I hear you calling, screaming inside. Screaming inside, the date is night. We stay up all night, into the light, into the morning when the rooster calls. You drink your whiskey, I've got nothing on your mouth full of whiskey, my mouth full of flowers, a bottle of this, and we're covered in hours of rolling in sweat, rolling in tears, watching the stars rising, kissing our fears goodbye.
Yeah, mosquito.
Damn, the mosquitoes found us.
That's what it did. Just
Let's
in
get
like
the
the
fuck
second
out of here.
half
The
of
second
the
part
song.
of
Light
the
is so nice right now, though.
Sweet, but we gotta go at least somewhere else, because the mosquitoes literally are like,
They're
oh, we
nuts.
found,
Y'all
we
were
found
like-
them.
I'm
We fit
videoing
the
you, I can see
jackpot.
one on
I know,
your
I'm
hand.
like, I know there was a point where I like was like,
Hey y'all, Kelly Moody here. You just heard a song with Bridget Downey and Soren Newson. There's another one of their songs at the end of the episode as well. Welcome to the Ground Shots Podcast, a podcast that explores our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling. A couple things before we get into just the guest for this episode, Calyx. Highly recommend you go subscribe to my Substack, groundshots.substack.com. And I was trying to write weekly for a little bit this summer. I'm not promising that right now, maybe in the future. I'm just writing when I have time and inspiration, and like something bubbles forth. And I'm kind of working on a few things right now for it, but mainly what I'm sharing on there are writing pieces, but I have shared some extra Ground Shots podcast episodes and reflections as well, so you can hear those only if you're paid subscriber, but a lot of the writing is free, or half of it's free, and then you have to pay to see the rest. But it's been a really good platform for me to express more ideas through writing, and I'm liking it a lot better than Patreon, which I did for years and years for the podcast. I still have the Patreon. I still appreciate people's support on there. Mainly when you subscribe on Patreon to support this, you get access to the library and archive of like stuff that I had put, especially in the years I was traveling and making zines and doing these land capsules and land updates all over the West. All of that's on the Patreon, and I'm gonna at some point figure out what to do with all that. Those resources, but you can still subscribe there to support this. All these platforms take a cut, and so remember, when you do say pick $5, I'm only actually getting like $3. So just like think about that too. It's unfortunate like that they take such a big percentage sometimes, especially Patreon. But just remember that when you're supporting. And I really could use the support right now. I am trying not to get too much into like that kind of stuff on here, like finances and stuff, but I'm still paying off all this stuff from my truck, repairing my truck this past year. And would really love to have more support for the podcast so I can be really spending more time on it. Some episodes take quite a while. If it's a 2-hour podcast episode, imagine it might take 7 hours to edit. And then that's just my time plus the overhead of like that costs money to host it and all this stuff. So any amount you can support per month, or if you want to give a one-time donation through PayPal or Venmo, anything is really helpful. And it just allows this program to exist. And we're hitting episodes in the late 70s right now, and I'm so excited to like get to 100 episodes and be like, I did this. We did this. If you wanted us to get to 100 episodes, I could use your support. You can also leave a review on iTunes. And I would love to see written reviews like of your reflections on the podcast as well on iTunes. I love seeing those. I check it all the time. Like, has anybody left a review? Like, maybe. I think we're at like also somewhere in the 70s with the number of 5-star reviews on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. If you want to pop on there and leave a review, I would love that. And tell us your favorite episode. You can also email me anytime, kelly@ofsedansalt.com, if you have any reflections on the podcast. Love to hear from you. Yeah, I'll have PayPal, Venmo, and Substack stuff in the show notes for this episode, and it's always on my website, ofsedansalt.com, and on every episode of the podcast for the most part. I also been listing a bookshop, couple bookshop links. Bookshop's kind of a cool platform online where you can couple things you can do. I have a wish list of books because I love books. And I've spent too much of my money on books, like especially this past year living in Paonia, Colorado, and going to the independent bookstore here, Paonia Books. I have ended up buying way too many books there, even though it's good for them. But one thing you could do to support me, my research, and it helps me with podcast research as well. I often read the books that people write, or like explore different writers and thinkers and read their work, and then I have them on a list to interview, and I actually can then like really know what their work is all about. So and how to like really engage people's work through reading, research. So you can buy me a book and I won't know who bought me what. That's what's really cool about it too. You can go on my wish list and you can pick something out and you can buy me a book and it'll get sent to me, but I won't know who it is. So that's something kind of cool. And then another way you can engage Bookshop is I have a book list that's recommended, and I've been slowly adding stuff on there. And some of the books are from past podcast episodes where we've mentioned those books a few times. And you can buy that book for yourself, and then the proceeds from that benefit a local bookstore. here where I live. And so instead of like a big corporate bookseller. So there's two things you can do. You buy yourself a book and the money goes to an independent bookseller, or you can buy me a book if you want to give me a gift of a book, and it'll come to me and I won't know who it is. I don't think there's any option for you to tell me who it is when you buy it, but I've been getting things in the mail here and there, and it's been really cool to see people buy me books. It feels really nice and supportive. One thing I've added that's like a thing that's vulnerable to add, but I put an Amazon wish list on the show notes, mainly just to finish my Airstream trailer renovation, my home that I live in. And it's just mostly like things I need to finish the renovation of the house I've been living in, because I don't have right now quite the resources to finish all the pieces and parts. So it's just like more like a little new water pump and wiring and like that kind of thing. So if you feel like you want to contribute to that in my life, the podcast is sort of hosted right now out of my mobile like trailer studio, and I would love to get more lights up, some of my wiring finished, my shelves finished putting up and that kind of thing. So there's some stuff on there if you want to contribute to that project just to be supportive. I have an Amazon wish list on there too. I wish there was a better platform to do wish lists for construction stuff like that. If you have an idea of another thing I could do instead, because I don't really like supporting Amazon, let me know. Email me, kelly@ofsudsalt.com, and I will change it to something else. Just to throw all that out there. And one more thing about me, and then we'll get into the podcast guest. Ground Shots Herbs. We're going to be doing an apothecary sale in September. And like I mentioned in the last episode, I haven't really done a full public sale online in about 2 years. I've sold a little bit in person to people, some of my old salves and tinctures and elixirs and bitters and stuff. And I've been making stuff last year and this year to do a sale, and I keep thinking, I want to do one, and then I postpone it. But this year I'm going to be for sure doing one in September, because I'm going to be teaching at and vending at a skills gathering here in Paonia called Forest and Field. That's run by Rooted Apothecary. Brianna and Kat are the organizers, both herbalists in the state of Colorado. And I'm teaching dog bane cordage and critical ethnobotany cordage and plant fibers for cordage. And I'm also going to be vending my medicines in person. There's going to be a cool gathering. We're going to have music. Ayla Nero is playing, and then also it's going to be an herbal conference and a skills gathering kind of all in one. I think there's only 50 tickets left as of today, this morning, seeing on their Instagram. So as I put this out, it's probably going to be even less than that. And I'll be vending in person there. And then after I'm done with that, what I have left, I will sell on an online sale for the broader public. I will be putting aside some things so that not everything sells out at the gathering. I have no idea what to expect, because it does seem like there's going to be a lot of people there, but I will set aside some things so there'll be a variety for the online sale. So getting myself ready for that, so then you guys who are far away from here and who love the desert salve, as people have been emailing me wanting more of it, you'll be able to get some in September. So that's it for me. There's some more things I could update you on, but I will do that in the next podcast episode. So this episode's guest is Calyx Liddick, and I know Calyx mainly because she signed up for an online class that I taught in the spring called Terra Talks, and was in the first session that I did along with a bunch of other really cool people. And we had really, really good conversation in our crew of people for both sessions that I did, but like that first one she was in. And during that class, I kept thinking, I really want to interview this person for my podcast at some point. And we made it happen after kind of like a few months of trying to pick a good time. Calyx runs a school in Pennsylvania called the North Appalachia School. And it's an herbal school, but they do a lot of foraging, plant walks, some some ancestral skill stuff, her and her partner. I'm going to read her bio from her website so you can hear a little bit more detail about who she is, and then I'll get into a tiny bit of stuff about what we're going to talk about. It's a long conversation, so I won't give all the details ahead of time summarizing it, but I'll give a few things. But Calyx is a bioregional herbalist, ethnobotanist, holistic nutritionist, wildcrafter, writer of poetry and prose, wildlife tracker, and mother of two. She was born and raised in the mountains of central Pennsylvania, and she is an outspoken advocate for accessible education, social and ecological justice, and ethical practice in plant work. As an educator in bioregional herbalism, Calyx is passionate about bridging the gap of perception between the personal body and the ecological body, and illuminating the wisdom of place and the potential of the direct reciprocation of health and well-being present in ecological stewardship. She is committed to integrating plant work as a lifeway, helping others develop a rooted relationship with the land and its more than human community, and healing the damage from extractive and hierarchical relationships between people and plants. In her practice, she integrates the long, rich history of traditional herbalism with modern, scientifically sound research. She graduated with honors from the Colorado School of Clinical Herbalism's fundamental and advanced medical herbalism intensives and completed other programs. So in this conversation with Calyx, we get into some really deep stuff, and I just want to say right now, trigger warning for this episode. I think I'm saying that because after I've listened to the whole thing and a few times in the editing process, realizing that some audience members might get triggered by the reality of the history of the stuff that we're going to be talking about. The relationship between conservation and eugenics is one of the main things we talk about in this episode, and it's just the reality of what has happened in our most really recent past in the US, but also in Europe too, and other parts of the world, but in the US, is really disturbing. And I don't want to shy away from conversations around things that are disturbing on the podcast, because I think the truth is important, or at least questions about these things are important. It's like the truth is also something we don't always fully know, but Calyx has done a lot of research on this history and has really broke it down in detail for this episode for us. And there's a lot of stuff that I didn't know. Gabe and I really dove into a little bit of like, hold on, there's something not quite right with conservation in some past podcast episodes that we did together. And as it's connected to conversations around wild tending, around indigenous land management practices, around how we see human interaction with ecology, how we see invasive plants and invasion biology, how we see what's a good plant or bad plant, or good landscape, bad landscape, sacrifice zones. These are all things that we've talked about in the podcast a lot in different ways with different people. But the way that Calyx lays out the eugenics piece for this episode is really intense and poignant, and like this, and it's needed. This truth is needed to be heard in the world. And just want to put out a trigger warning. There's nothing like super violent that we talk about, although there was this whole thing is violent. How the connection between race hierarchy and eugenics is connected to landscape hierarchy, and basically landscape conservation is inherently violent, but we don't get into like the details of some of those things. So that's just a caveat on the trigger warning. I just want to say that like that, just so people know that this isn't necessarily gonna be us laughing the whole time kind of conversation, although like we do some of that of course too. But I was enthralled in this. I interviewed Calyx for this on the side of the road in Twin Lakes, Colorado, right after I had seen my professor, Kip Reddick. Hippie Kippy is his trail name on the Appalachian Trail. After I just saw him on Hope Pass, right by Twin Lakes, one of the hardest passes on the Colorado Trail. And then the next day or so, I had it scheduled to interview Calyx. I was like, all right, I think I can figure this out here in the woods. And I sat by the visitor center in Twin Lakes and did this. So we had a little bit of glitches around service for that. But I figured it out halfway through, so I kind of edited out as much as I could. That was like us having to restart a few times. But I did that interview in my car, sitting in this place that I've spent a lot of time, doing the work for the Colorado Trail Project. I just felt like 2 hours went by and I was just like, I was so entranced and enthralled in this conversation and just learning about this history. We know, some of us, about people like John Muir or Teddy Roosevelt. But there are some other people in this past, and I'm flipping through my notebook right now because I wrote so much down for this. Show notes are going to be longer. They're going to be more extensive on my website. All the things we list as much as we can. Calyx also sent me a list of resources. I can't fit all of that in the iTunes show notes, so I try, for especially these episodes with longer show notes, to link directly at the top of that to my website so you can see the bigger resource list. But I will be putting all of the stuff in there. There's definitely people within the history of conservation that we've never heard of, like Madison Grant and scientific racism, which we talk about in this episode. I think Calyx lays it out, the reasons why there's shame about that history, but yet that history affects everything that we're doing now, even though we want to erase the fact that it happened, even super recently. And it even is, people are still being forced sterilization and some of these practices that are based around this whole I don't know if you call it a theology of eugenics, of like this idea that there needs to be racial purity, is still happening today, and it's not actually in the past. And there's problems as in how it's connected to the conservation, ecological conservation world. And I think what Calyx illuminates in this episode is like, hey, we need to look at all this because we're not really getting at the point here if we don't. And is this actually what we need to be doing in modern times as things are rapidly hitting the fan, I guess, shit hitting the fan, is like, is this really the right direction to be coming at things? Especially with this past as the framework for so much of the work we do with land conservation and preservation and stewardship, and like the ways that we see what that should look like. So that's the main thing that we focus on in this episode, but we come at it from a lot of different directions, touch on a lot of different subjects. I'm really, really excited about this one, and I wanted to put it out pretty soon after the one I did with Sylvia, just because I have like I said, I have a queue of episodes to put out right now, and this one just seems super important, and I just wanted to get it out there for y'all to get into. I'm gonna also be putting Calyx's info in the show notes for you guys to be able to contact her or see her website. She has some really good writing on her blog about a lot of these topics as well. She's a wonderful writer and researcher and thinker and teacher. Before we leave the intro, if you want to support the music for this episode, the musicians who contributed their music, Bridget and Soren, I will be putting their Venmo in the show notes as well. Just want to throw that in here at the end before we transition from the intro to the show and the interview here. All right, y'all. Happy listening.
I'm Calyx Liddick, and I run the Northern Appalachia School here in South Central Pennsylvania with my partner Jay Bird, Jay Tigner. And so I'm located in the valley right next to South Mountain. So we kind of border Show State Forest, and then the area that we're in is a lot of like orchard country. And I'm about half an hour from the state capitol. So we're in an area that has a lot of mixture of like rural region and kind of a lot of like suburban spur, that kind of thing going on. So I'm from this area. I'm from Perry County, which is up in the mountains north of here, a much more rural area. I lived there my entire childhood, and kind of grew up in the very rural mountains up there. And then I went out to Colorado. I went to the Colorado School of Clinical Herbalism to study herbalism, and that's where I got my most of my botany education and that kind of thing out there. Had my son and moved back, and since I've been back here, having a young child and then two young children, what I've been focusing on is like taking that knowledge that I learned from school and integrating that into the relationship that I have with plants that I've known my entire life, but didn't really fully see, you know. So that's been a lot of my work since I've been back this past, like, you know, it's been almost, my son's 8 now, so it's been almost a decade. And, you know, I started the school in 2020. We launched the school in the height of lockdown. It was the very beginning of lockdown, I guess. And it's something that I've been wanting to do for a very long time, because one of my main interests is how people interact with plants and relationships with plants. So, you know, I do the clinical work, but my primary interest is actually how are people actually interacting, and what do those relationships look like? Because we have a lot of relationships with plants and a lot of them are very unhealthy. So this area that I'm in now, you know, this is Susquehannock land. Just, you know, we're occupying Susquehannock land. The Susquehannock are an extinct tribe, functionally extinct. So that's been a very interesting aspect to all of this, you know, because I'm not in a place where there is access to those kind of conversations and community of people who have been tending this land for a long time.
You're in southern Pennsylvania, or you're in Maryland? I think it's southern Pennsylvania, right?
We're in southern Pennsylvania, yeah, like South Central. We're like 30 minutes north of the border of Maryland.
Cool. And I've driven through that area before going to New Hampshire, when I used to do these sort of yearly missions up there to work, and I always would take time to drive along that river and like through that area, because I didn't want to stay on the coast where the cities were and deal with that whole path north. I would go inland, and that's mainly my experience of that region, other than like having a stint of living in northern Virginia and spending a little time on the Potomac River and in Maryland in that region. But it seems like an interesting zone between the north and the south. I guess it's like the mid-Atlantic is the kind of a bioregion that you would use to describe that region, as it bleeds from northern lands to southern lands, where you have aspects of the north, birch trees, you know, and then aspects of the south, like the swampy, you know, probably sycamores and stuff like that. Maybe, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like kind of the blending, and in that it's probably a pretty interesting zone to be playing with.
It is. Yeah. I mean, I think we're really lucky right here between the climate and, like you're talking about, we're in that blending of the two zones, because there is, you know, if you go a little bit farther south, it feels like you're in the south. And if you go a little farther north, it feels like you're in the north. It doesn't take too long to get up into birch territory. And then, you know, right below us is, you know, Maryland, Virginia is starting to feel more like the South, which is very interesting. Where I am, like, if we go up into Michaud, up into the mountains, there's some really fascinating plants, and there's some really, you know, interesting, you know, it's a very interesting ecosystem down in the valley, and you're going, you know, to different regions, because it's almost like a pine barren in a lot of Michaud, at least in this region. I don't know about, you know, I know it kind of continues down into the south. I'm not sure how it changes. I haven't explored that area quite as much, but so yeah, it gives me a chance to see lots of different things, but also a chance to focus on a smaller selection of plants that are right next to me. And you know, I'm a big fan of the weeds, so I spend a lot of my time focusing on the plants that are you know, the underrepresented or underappreciated plants. And I feel like those are just as valuable of a, you know, of species to talk about in this area, even though maybe they haven't been around for as long. But yeah, it's a very, you know, I never in this area, I always expected to go, you know, like down to North Carolina or go out west or something. And I never expected to settle here, but the fact that I'm still here now, and I'm planning on being here for the next several years, has been a really great, actually, opportunity to see, you know, all of the different things going on in the area. So, and really appreciate them.
Yeah. We've known each other online a bit over the years, but you were in a class I held this spring, kind of an experimental, not quite an herbalism class, but it's like a critical ecology class or something, or like topics in politics and ecology and sociology and ethnobotany, and I felt like during that I got to know you a little bit, even just because we had a small group where we were all engaged in this shared work together, and we all got to share the places we come from and what work we're trying to do in that place, and how what we were doing together is relevant to that. And I remember you saying that, you know, we talked a lot about things like wilderness and wildness and invasive plants. These are all things we'll get into a little bit in this conversation today too, but how you painted the picture of where you were as a place where, like, you know, rural lands meet suburbia, and then you also like do a lot of your stuff in the city, and how suburbia, like these ideas of what wildness is and what are good landscapes and places to be in engagement and connection. And like oftentimes these areas with like a lot of human development, cities and suburban areas, people don't think of as like places where you would want to study herbalism or something, or ethnobotany, but in actuality they're probably some of the places that need that the most. And yeah, I think it's cool that you're kind of positioning yourself in like a zone like that. And it's not always easy. And maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So I'm a very rural person. My entire life. I've never lived in the city, unless you can consider Boulder, Colorado a city. I don't know if I would necessarily. So I've really just developed this interest in urban ecology in the past like year or two. So I'm new into it. I'm still kind of feel like I'm dipping my toe, but where we're located here, you know, it's a rural location, but we're very close to a lot of major cities on the Eastern Seaboard. So we're very close to Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and, you know, Baltimore and New York City. I was just up in New York City this past month teaching a class up there. And then obviously, you know, in Harrisburg, which is very close to me. And so, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've been focusing on and thinking a lot about is the way that we label things and the way that we put things into boxes and categories. And one of the things that we do in ecology is we make these quarantine zones, right? So we have the quarantine zones and the sacrifice zones. And that's where a lot of our mistakes, I think, come from as far as conservation goes and understanding ecology, because they all feed into each other. So for me, as like a bioregional herbalist and a bioregionally living person, as much as I try to be, I'm acknowledging, you know, that every aspect of my life, that I, you know, and anything that I'm not able to see and be directly accountable for, as far as, you know, the materials and food and all of that kind of stuff that I'm using, and partaking in, you know, if that's coming from something else and I'm not able to be accountable for that's having an effect on that place. And so that's one of the main reasons why I am a bioregional herbalist, is because I want to be able to be accountable and not just accept that, you know, that there are quarantine regions and there's, you know, areas where we are, you know, regarding as some place that can be a dumping ground or as a place where we can be exploitive. And I feel like it's the same thing with, you know, rural and cities. You said we talked a lot about in that class about the definition of wilderness, and some of the research and reading that I've been doing about urban ecology has really opened my eyes to understanding urban spaces as being a wilderness of their own, and a very fascinating topic to study because there's so much rapid change happening. They're very high pressure systems. And so I feel like studying those spaces is really the trajectory of, you know, the anthropogenic landscapes and kind of where we're pushing things. So we're able to measure things really quickly. I mean, that's one of the things about ecology, right? Is that things happen on a very, generally speaking, they happen on a very slow, you know, geologic timescale. And as human beings, we have a really hard time grasping that and fully understanding that and being patient enough to let it play out and see, you know, how they're going to turn out. And so when we are looking at things in the city, they're sped up. I just find that really fascinating. I think it's been really interesting to study. And then to finally, like I said, this past couple of years, get to spend some more time in the city with that new set of eyes has been great.
It is interesting. Yeah, in that class, one of the topics we dove into, and of course, it was one of these things where we were like dipping into a lot of topics that really help illuminate what I was trying to create in the holding that space was like a place to explore some of these ideas. And these are things I've been getting into on the podcast over the years as well. That what are these things that are part of our culture that influence us to think about the landscape in a certain way? Because I have a hard time, like when I'm teaching about herbalism or ecology or botany, plant ID, to not like include so much of that into the work, because for me it's so vitally relevant. If we're going to be talking about like people and their relationship to plants or the living world around us, it's not really just like a here, be familiar with these beings again. It's like, well, how are we seeing these beings, and how are we seeing our relationship with placeness, and so it's like it requires stepping back several steps to look at like why we are defining things in certain ways, and why we relate to the land in certain ways that we don't even realize we're doing. And so that the container of that class was like an exploration in that. And one of the things we talked about a bit was like wilderness, which is a big topic in conservation. It's a big topic often in outdoor world, like it is in like indigenous sovereignty work. Like just it's a conversation that's in conservation, like it's a conversation that is happening. Like what is our relationship with this idea of like landscapes that are pristine or unpeopled or wild in a particular kind of way? And so we dove pretty deep into that. Of course, I felt like that class could have been like 10 weeks long instead of 3, but and it's interesting to think about like flipping the sort of traditional way see that word or those ideas on its head and be like, well, what about these highly people affected places like cities, and what makes that not a wilderness?
The conservation movement started in cities because there was such an influx of immigration, and cities were expanding really rapidly, and there was such a major class divide already that there was a lot of issues with pollution and with just general quality of life in those urban centers. And so, essentially, which as this is the case with pretty much all of the early conservation movement, the wealthy patricians, the wealthy aristocrats of those areas decided to start creating parks. So like the Bowling Green and areas like that. And eventually, we get into like Central Park, and all of those kinds of spaces developed as a place for wealthy, city residents to have a place to go to escape city life. And so that's where things actually began. So there was very much an understanding early on of the fact that, people need access to green spaces and they need access to clean air. And at that point, a large part of conservation also was about having access to recreation. So to things like, hunting and horseback riding and things like that. So that's actually the conservation movement started in the cities and then branched out, because one of the other things that was happening, in the 19th century was those wealthy, white rich dudes basically were saying, okay, so we have these parks, but it's not enough. We need to get out and we need to explore. And they had the time and the money to get away from the city for these long, explorations and hunting escapades and stuff, where they would go to different parts of the world or to remote areas of the United States. And they would go on like hunting expeditions or or whatever, and so that was a big part of the reason why it transitioned to wilderness, or to more remote areas, where they were trying to essentially conserve the resources that they were participating in. So they wanted to conserve game. That's actually the major the first stepping stone of conservation after that kind of development of parks in urban zones, was that these men wanted to preserve game so that they could hunt them. And so that was kind of the next step. So that's where we can talk about like the Boone and Crockett Club and all of that kind of stuff, which is a really interesting part of conservation history. But I just that's something that I did not know, for many years. I didn't understand that it didn't just start with saying, oh, well, we need to, preserve these resources, these forests and things like that. It was really just a matter of like people were in the cities and they were suffering, and they were looking for a way out. But yeah. So, and I think, discussing this idea of wilderness and the whole quarantine zone idea, it's interesting when we look back, like you were saying, that the class that you were teaching, you were trying to, and this is a big part of my work as well. It's really the reason why I started the school, is to illuminate the crossover of these topics, of the social issues, of economic issues with the way that we interact with the landscape, or what, whether it be plants or wildlife or whatever aspects of that landscape. I feel like there's so little discussion of that, we live in a very fragmented, one of the fallout of colonial capitalism is that we live in a very fragmented society where everything is put into these containers, and so trying to basically bridge that gap again and help people understand that there is no difference between studying, that it's all connected, whether we're studying anthropology or economics or history or herbalism or ecology or all of these things, they all tie back in together. And what I have found really interesting is following that thread of plants and land use, all the way from Europe to over to the Americas, and that process of colonization. If you follow the thread of plants to where we are today, whether it be like herbal commerce or just herbalism in general, you follow that back, it's just strewn with all of these different social issues that people tend to ignore and kind of push to the wayside. So I'm really just excited to be having this conversation and know you, and that you're having these conversations and having these thoughts and doing work around it also.
There's a lot to all that, and it's gosh history of conservation, and the languages we use to speak about plants, and even in this sort of resurgence movement that's been happening in the US, people's interests in plant medicine or herbalism or like so-called natural healing, you have a lot of people trying to take on educating about plants and landscape, and with good intentions to a degree, often, not always, but with good intentions to a degree of like reconnection, right? But I can't help but look through a lens of seeing anthropologically all of this. Like when I watch people teach, or I watch what people are putting out there and what they're saying about plants or our relationship with them, it's really often not like unanalyzed, looking deeper and further. Like the language that gets used is kind of recited from what they heard, or what's already within the context of the situation we're in our culture. So it's like heal yourself, or like be in connection, like reconnect to the land again, or like it's kind of like with this whole idea that we've like fallen from Eden, right? And we got to find our way back. And like there's so much in this narrative that is almost reinforcing still this like human nature separation, even within like people trying to re-educate about plants. And also within that too, right? Like the kind of layers that we are swimming through of like where we're at now, and how we're being taught to see, even if it's subconsciously, like what landscapes are worthy of our attention or not worthy of our attention, which ones are good or not good. And it's like that's even comes out, right, in well-meaning people's teachings about like plants, like this is a good plant, this is not a good plant, or this landscape is good or not good. And I'm like, wait a minute, I just really felt after studying herbalism myself, or like being a farmer and then studying herbalism, like wait a minute, there's like there's like 10 steps back here that need to be taken before we can actually have right relations in the world we live in today. Like what, and I think doing all this, talking about all these things helps us get closer to figuring out what we could do moving forward in this world, than it is to just, regurgitate information that other people have fed us with still the lens and framework of our cultural idea of like really that we're separate from the land and we don't actually deserve it or be in connection with it or something. Still kind of a part of the narrative, and then wrapping that into like the whole history of the conservation movement in the US. I mean, a lot of people don't, it's like, oh, it's just, oh, we've always had wilderness, so we've always had public land. Well, of course we haven't. And how the story of how that came to be is something a lot of people don't realize has so many roots and like problematic things. I mean, something that you said during the class, like that I remember so poignantly, was like, we need to kind of, you're like, honestly, because of how much conservation's born out of eugenics, and maybe we could get into that a little bit, that there's what we're kind of working with now, like you're like, I think we just need to scrap the whole thing and start over. Like,
yeah,
so fraught with problems.
Yeah, I mean,
scrap the whole thing and start over, which I thought was like a big thing to say,
I think, the issue is that it's not, I mean, it's eugenics is a big part of it, and we can definitely get into that, but it's all of the aspects, it's all of the aspects in which conservation was birthed. Certainly there was, to a degree, that aspect of trying to protect the landscape, and we can talk about, I mean, there's so many different avenues we can start with. I'm trying to figure out like where is point A, like where do we actually start this conversation? But to say that like there are so many different problematic things that aren't just part of this whole discussion of conservation today and how it started, but like literally are the reason why it started. It's the same reason why we have this issue, like you were just talking about, this issue of trying to help people feel reconnected, like they have a sense of place, and assigning value to the landscape or to plants or to people or whatever it may be, trying to figure out how all that works and how to find reconnect to a sense of place. It's the same issue. We have that disconnect because that's how our society was built. Our society, as a whole was built on the backbone of disconnecting people from place. That's why we are where we are today. I mean, we can go back to where things were, basically a lot of this stuff, what I'm finding and have been for the last few years, is that we can trace it back to the beginning of capitalism, the move away from feudalism into capitalism and the enclosures and, basically privatization and exclusivity of land ownership and land rights. And so that desire to reconnect comes from that. We have a desire, like in my opinion, subsistence culture is sustainable. It's kind of like the natural economic system of a human being, not capitalism. And so we're constantly in this struggle against capitalism to return to subsistence culture, but our society and our laws are put in place to keep us separated from the land. It's not just that we've been told that we're separate from nature, it's that our society actually has laws preventing us, and social norms also obviously preventing us from being connected to the land, that was taken away from us by social and economic elites. And so one of the reasons why immigrants came to the Americas, to the United States, was to escape capitalism, was to escape the enclosures. There were between the 16th and 18th century, there was a lot of riots, enclosure riots and things like that going on because they were fighting against that, because they wanted to hold on to their subsistence culture. So they came here, and then the exact same thing happened, and that was played out and put into action in large part by the conservation movement. So that, as far as like trying to unravel this story of conservation, it's a really difficult thing to do because people are afraid that if we have these conversations and we talk about the foundations of conservation and environmentalism, that it will hurt the movement. But I really believe, yeah, that we need to, like, I think I said in the class, we got to kind of burn it to the ground and start over. And I think the reason for that is because we're in a losing battle. We're not going to succeed because all of this stuff is founded on corruption and exploitation. So in order to understand all of that, we have to go back and really scour history and look for the things that we're not, that are not well published or that have been deliberately hidden from, from people, in order to understand why we are where we are today and why we're feeling the things that we're feeling today and why we're struggling so much, socially and financially and all of those things, physically. Our health is suffering. And I feel like, where we are right now, like this is the first year where I feel like so many people are seeing the effects of climate change to such an extreme degree, where we're realizing that we're running out of time to like make serious change. And so that's been one of my I'm on this path, this journey to like try to understand this information and kind of connect the dots for people and show them what I've learned and what I'm seeing. And I'm feeling a bit of pressure this year of like, okay, I think I need to stop being afraid to say these things, because somebody might say, oh, well, you're going to hurt the conservation movement, or you're going to make people, think that it's all for naught or something. I think that it's really time that we start having these conversations, because we're not going to heal and we're not going to be able to move forward until we can understand, where it all started. So I think, between the enclosures and capitalism and basically this push towards, pushing people into wage labor, the eugenics movement and systemic racism, a lot of we can definitely get into that topic for sure, but that is a very large part of it. And yeah, so there's so many different aspects that are really, really harmful and oppressive. And the thing is that I would love to be able to say that those are our roots, but we've grown up and the conservation movement today is different. But the fact of the matter is that it's still present in so much of the science, of the social constructs, of the policies, of the way that we communicate, the words that we use, the terms that we, the way we label things and name things. It's still there. So it's something that we need to be talking about, because it's not like it's just part of our past. It's the same, it's still happening today.
Yeah, I think this is something I encountered when holding space for this class too, is that the conversation around like getting at the core of what it means to really connect with plants, right? To take 5 to 10 steps back, it's not a linear work, it's like a circular thing. And so entering it into it at any point in the circle will then lead to all the other things. And so we've kind of entered into it a little bit from like, okay, the history of conservation as it's also influenced by Eurocentric colonial culture and how that imposition of the stories that were coming over here influenced everything, and I mean, the way that we understand conservation and wilderness is a very American created thing, and uniquely so, even though there are roots to things before America, I guess, obviously. And I think it's one of the things that's probably vitally important to start with. We could talk about all these other pieces and stuff too, but just like, yeah, capitalism, it's so daunting to really think about how much it's permeated every aspect of our lives, and how it feels like we can acknowledge and realize that it's done that and affected our understanding of nature and our understanding of ourselves in the landscape. But understanding that being the case and then not knowing how to fully step out of it or step away from it or step into a new lens is a really kind of, it's a tough struggle. But I think the first step is to realize that that's what's happening, because I think a lot of people still aren't like, what's this plant good for? It's still kind of this interesting, like that's often what I hear when I'm teaching, what's this plant good for? And it's like, well, is capitalism influencing us to think about
Yeah.
everything is about a resource, you know? It's
Mhm.
it de-animize, like I don't even know if that's the right, if that even is a word, but de-animistic way of thinking about like the living world as being a means to an end for our needs as people, like centric and centered around that. And that is a because of capitalism, but it's also got other elements to it too, like religious roots, which we got into a bit in the class. And it's like hard to not talk about, you know, institutional religion and like the way that spirituality and religion have been manipulated to control people and land and resources, and basically for a small amount of people to have more greed, you know, and how all that trickles into where we're at now with plants and landscapes, and like how conservation like plays itself out. In it's really like, you know, all public land designations still tend to be oriented around resource, not around protecting the land for itself in its own like value in it just being. It's still often oriented around, well, is it useful for recreation, you know, or is
Mhm.
it useful for logging, or at some point potentially mining, or like fracking or whatever, like, and how we understand this whole, right, this whole sense of like good and bad landscapes, or like landscapes that are worthy, is all based in resource.
I don't know if you've ever dived into um, the theories around like land valuation in the very beginning of colonization and kind of like where that comes from. This is something that I'm just starting to like feel like we're just starting to wrap my head around, because it seems so crazy. I mean, it makes sense with our modern society, but there is this dude named John Locke that basically came up with this idea. I don't know if he came up with it, but he was vocal and wrote about his idea of how we value land under a capitalist system, which is basically that land is only useful if it's in production. And when I say in production, I don't just mean like it's it's providing subsistence for people. It's you know like if we think of the way that indigenous people were utilizing the land prior to colonization, that land was heavily in use. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of stewardship and land management and alterations to the landscape that was resulting in production of large amounts of food and game and subsistence materials and things like that. That's not what he was talking about. He was talking about production as far as exchange value, so as a commodity. And that's a really important distinction to make, because that really, for me, was the illuminating factor here of realizing this is how deep capitalism really runs. So we fail to value something unless we can actually unless there's actually an exchange profit margin, right? And so regardless of whether a piece of land is supporting a human being or a community of ecological beings, doesn't matter if there can't be profit made off of it. And so that's where some of that valuation comes from. And then when we go and we look at the roots of conservation, like I said, so the Boone and Crockett Club was the first large scale in the United States, was the first large scale conservation organization. It was before people often think the Sierra Club was the first. The Boone and Crockett Club was the first, and this was an elite hunting club, an exclusive hunting club in New York City. And the goal of these men, it was a place for men to go and to share stories and have camaraderie, with other people, other men that were interested in hunting, and share their tales and that kind of stuff. And then eventually this group morphed into a conservation organization where they were trying to preserve game. So it was very much a valuation system of extraction, right? Of we want to preserve this because it has value directly to us for something that we want. so it was an exploitive valuation. And the men that were involved in that group, so that we're talking about lots and lots and like pretty much all of the actors in the early conservation movement, the ones who began that movement, were part of the Boone and Crockett Club. They were also largely part of the American Eugenics Society, which we can talk about that overlap. But it's at a certain point in time, there was a branching off of ideas. So we have the utilitarian conservation movement, and then we have this branching off of the aesthetic preservationists, and they kind of came from, was born a little bit out of the transcendental movement of this idea of intrinsic value, right? So something that actually has intrinsic value in and of itself, that that's where that idea of separation from nature, we're also seeing that play out there, where a piece of land or a particular, not so much a resource in their mind, but a particular piece of land, or an entity, whether it be elk, or, a particular species of tree or something, that landscape should be preserved because it has its own intrinsic value. And that was a branching off of that utilitarian movement, conservation movement. And so, we see that divergence, and that's a really important divergence. We still see that today. We still see that kind of dichotomy. And I find that really interesting. So if we take like kind of two characters in the early conservation movement, right? So we can talk about trying to decide who should we choose. So if we take Gifford Pinchot, he's a really, really great, so he was a Pennsylvania governor, and we have, Gifford Pinchot State Park is really close to where I live. So Gifford Pinchot was the classic utilitarian conservationist. He believed that if you drive like a few minutes from my house and you get into Michaud, right where like the Mason-Dixon Trail starts, you drive down that road, and there will be signs all over the forest boundary that says trees are crops. And that notion came from Gifford Pinchot. He was a forester. He went to, forget what college he graduated from, some Ivy League school here, and then he studied forestry in Europe. And he came back, with this idea that this very, very concrete utilitarian conservationist mindset, that trees are crops, and that we should conserve resources in a way to make them the most efficient. So he's all about efficiency. Now, on the one hand, that gap between human and nature was bridged, which is a positive thing. So we understood people are utilizing resources. We need to be able to preserve them efficiently so that we don't destroy those resources and have nothing left. So he was about government control of resources to preserve them for our use. And that's, it's exploitive and extractive, but at the same time, there was an understanding of that needed to be done. And then you have on the other side, we have people like John Muir, who were the aesthetic preservationists. So they believed that there was more value to a landscape than just its resources, its crops, and so, but there was a large part of that. So that's a positive thing, right? So we're acknowledging intrinsic value, but it was the removal of people from that landscape that gave it its value. It was like that disconnect. So John Muir was very much, a lot of his language was what we see in the 1964 Wilderness Act, that definition of that, like wilderness is, a place that's untrammeled by man, where man is just a visitor, that language, that's very much John Muir, aesthetic preservationist kind of language. So we have these two kind of sects, these two different branching off of conservation, these two movements that were oftentimes, fighting against each other, and often like kind of like if someone was trying to, if one particular conservationist was trying to get a policy passed, then another conservationist might have kind of went in and basically tried to get it vetoed or something, because they were conflicting. And we still see that today. And I think that when we're talking about the valuation of something, I feel like both of those sides have really valuable perspectives, and yet at the same time they've entirely missed the point. And if we can come back to that understanding of seeing human beings on the landscape in kinship with the other community members in the land itself, of wherever it is that they're residing, like that's where Indigenous people have historically been in relationship with the land. It's where all cultures came from to a degree. I mean, I know, like I know in my heart that I have European ancestors from Ireland and Italy and and different parts of Europe, Polish ancestors, and I know that we all have that somewhere deep inside of us where we know that's possible. And so I feel like I see these two opposing forces, kind of like if we can find the value in both of them, and then understand where they went wrong, then we kind of have a solution, the solution to conservation and kind of where things went south. And what's so frustrating is that both of these different directions, right? Both of these different types of conservationism, because of their white supremacy, they failed to acknowledge, and not just white supremacy, but also their ethnocentrism, in that the way that they valued knowledge and education and communication and all that kind of stuff. They failed to acknowledge and even see that the Indigenous people that were here prior to colonization were doing it. They were already there. They were doing it. There was a way larger population of Native people here than I think most people actually can wrap their head around. And by the time these people came along, these early conservationists we're talking about the 1800s, we had already forgotten how many people were actually here. Very large populations. So we know that this landscape can sustain large populations of people if we are in relationship with the land. And so, but whether it's John Muir or whether it's Gifford Pinchot or whether it was Teddy Roosevelt or Madison Grant, whoever, they refuse to see the value of traditional ecological knowledge, essentially, and integrate that into their practices. They refuse to even acknowledge that it existed. For the most part, there are accounts of John Muir, like, noticing that Native people, altered the landscape, and there's certainly accounts of how they used fire and things like that. But there was never a movement towards understanding that knowledge, towards trying to include Native people into any decisions. That whole movement was designed to push those people off the land. And it wasn't just a land grab. It was a big part of it. It wasn't just to have control, and power. It wasn't just about having land ownership or power over resources. It also came from this desire to, from this perspective of white supremacy and racism. And I think that's one of the most frustrating things for me, is like just the complete and utter inability to even see what's right in front of you, because they were just so clouded by that. Talking about how we value things, the language that we use to, in terms of how we value things, and then the policies that come from all of that, and the way we conduct our science and all of that stuff. We're coming from this underlying disconnect. All of it comes from that. So yeah.
I think often it's come down for me to like wild tending's the answer, even though still those are not even the right words to use in some ways, because we have to look at what we think wildness is, and it's kind of an oxymoron in a way, because wildness usually means self-willed without human interaction, or without it's like still, it sort of like precludes the human in its definition. But to get to that, like, and this is something when in my field ecology classes, and then like I'm trying to teach things like Terra Talks that I was doing this spring, the biggest thing I've been trying to impart to people is like, there's a lot that we don't see that's right in front of us that is that we need to be seeing, or we need to be able to like look at in it from a different way, because of the fact that we have all of these pieces from our history that we haven't looked at and that are influencing us to see in a certain way. I think because I study philosophy, so John Locke and the utilitarianism, like when I first looked at some of these ideas, I never thought about how they actually apply to our culture and our world until I've been an adult and lived out my life considering them more and more in this, especially in my focus on plant work. But thinking about Socrates' allegory of the cave is something that I think about a lot in this too. It's like the whole story of like these people in a cave, and they're like, they're kind of like chained down to these seats, you know, and they're looking at the side of the cave, and there's these people behind them like playing the shadow puppet. It was kind of a genius story and metaphor, you know, like, and there's different ways that it's told, but basically the shadow puppet show that these people are watching, and they're chained down, and they're not allowed to look to the side or look away, or that they have been chained down to it, and that's all they see, and that's reality. And then as soon as someone breaks free from a chain and realizes that they're being shown a puppet show and that somebody's shining the light and like making the puppet show for them and forcing them to look at it, and they step outside the cave and they realize the whole thing was played out for them in that way. Like that's kind of what I think about in this way. And it's like that happens in so many ways in our lives. Like, that's a kind of matrixy type of metaphor. That's kind of, the Matrix is based off some of these ideas. The movie The Matrix, that people like, I think it's the easiest way for our modern culture, like mainstream modern culture, to understand this idea of like being convinced of one reality and then realizing that it was all a facade, you know?
Right.
But this story is old, you know. The story is the allegory of the cave has been around for a while. And I think, like, you know, the first European people coming over, and perhaps, you know, again, we have ancestry and pastoralism and land tending and being in connection when there wasn't private land ownership, where the landscape was a part of what it meant to be human. Like, that is a part of many European ancestor people's heritage, not really that far back for some of us. But coming over here, having been subject to having that taken away, right, and then being in this landscape, partly too because, you know, the European landscapes looked really different too, and then there's these other cultural things that are happening in Europe, and coming over to Turtle Island and being unable to see what was happening. And there's other factors too, you know, like there have been a lot of disease that swept through before most of the big contact happened, and that like really affected the way that indigenous peoples were managing the landscapes too. But like, what is considered productive, right? Like you're saying, the meme of like productiveness with the idea of like capitalist, or like productive for building a house, productive for selling lumber, productive for building a fence, like whatever, like productive in this particular kind of materialism orientation, coming over and not understanding like there was a production happening in a way, like people manage the landscapes that were here for specific reasons, but in a different kind of mindset of like reciprocity a lot of the time. Not always. Of course we have highly agricultural peoples like the Cahokia, you know, who did deplete their lands, their lands, that we can't like just say, oh, like all people here were living in harmony. That's like a whole thing too. But like so much is not seen, and then now here we are today, and people think, okay, this is wild, and this is like this is like where the humans are, and this is where the wildness is. But then like stepping out into a forest and not realizing that maybe a lot of this forest might be here because indigenous peoples like historically tended that in a certain way, and we're still seeing that, but we're blind, you know. And that's the
Yeah, I
big
mean,
thing I think I've been trying to like figure out how to translate to people, even if I don't know all the ways that every single person should look at what plants and what places. um you know, like, oh, that hickory tree might be there for a certain reason, or that like pawpaw might be there for a certain reason, or that biscuit root might be there for a certain reason. It still kind of blows people's minds, like, and when you flip it around though, you're like, but really there's no way it could have been any other way, you know, like people didn't wander aimlessly looking for food and
right.
medicine, you know, either. And so that blinder piece, how do you lift the blinder when you start to? It's just like, wow, there's so much, everything just looks different. That's what's interesting, you know, and thinking about the allegory of the cave kind of like story and
Right.
metaphors, like everything suddenly is different when you take the chain off. You know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, exactly, because the like our ecological baseline, our baseline that we base all of our conservation ideas and policies on is incorrect, right? Because of what we're just talking about, what you're just mentioning, that like, you know, by the time scientists at that point in time were really just, you know, once again, rich white dudes that had enough time on their hand and enough funding to come over and write stuff down, things were already changed. Yeah, the landscape was already completely altered because of the amount of disease and destruction that had you know, swept through, you know, the United States. And my understanding is that the disease moved so rapidly through trade routes and everything else that it had already reached the West Coast before any white person reached the West Coast. So that's how fast it moved, and that's how many people it killed. So yeah, we saw this massive destruction of, you know, one of the primary keystone, probably the primary keystone species of North America, which was indigenous people. And then also the removal of all these other keystone species. So like the beavers and the, you know, the bison and, you know, all of these species. We see this massive change in the landscape, which, you know, succession, and once you remove fire and you remove, you know, all of these ecosystem engineers from their landscape, you see succession kind of takes over, and you see more of a wilderness take shape, which is more forested areas and things like that. So yeah, I mean, our whole basis of, you know, and this is when we talk about like the whole, you know, native and non-native plant thing. This is the reason why I've stopped using the term native and non-native plant, because all of that is based on, you know, if you to be a native plant, you have to have been here before before 1492, and you know, at that point in time, I feel like we don't even really have a full clear picture of what things even look like. So for us today to be trying to put things into that category of native versus non-native birth based on this particular cutoff date just blows my mind. So yeah, so all of the, no matter whether it's how we're managing plants or where all these different things that we might be doing, the way that we're managing landscapes, it's based on a misunderstanding of what the ecology even looked like. And that's if we're trying to preserve the ecology that was here prior to colonization. And that's another mistake that we make, which is, you know, another one of the shadow puppets there is this idea that ecology is static, and that it's not supposed to change. And so we're trying to keep things static and still in a particular time period that we don't even understand, when that is not even what ecology is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be moving and breathing and changing and shifting and all of that kind of stuff all the time. And especially, you know, we as human beings today have put so much tremendous pressure on our environment, and then to constrain it and say you're not allowed to change, you're not allowed to adapt. It's just very backwards. It's I don't know, it doesn't make any sense to me. But you know, the other thing that I want to, before I forget, I want to go back to is, you know, you talked about how like the Cahokia, you know, being a particular population that did you know, overutilize their resources, and that kind of that myth of, well, all indigenous people, you know, perfectly tended the landscape. So we certainly know that the vast majority of them had and today still have that basis of understanding enough to be able to sustainably, survive and thrive on the landscape for that many thousands of years. And there may be exceptions to that, but I think it's important to acknowledge also that that same like misinterpretation is true of immigrants, of American settlers, European settlers. It's the same story gets told, where we get told that people came here and they destroyed the resources that were here. They destroyed the environment rapidly. And I remember always thinking that I always pictured in my head these, frontiersmen going out and hunting and building the log cabins and just cutting forests down. And those were the ones that destroyed the landscape, and they altered the landscape. And there was a little bit of that going on. But when we think about, like, if we talk about the Adirondacks, right, which is one of the early projects for the conservation movement, was the people that were there. It's a very harsh environment. The people that were there were Native people that had been pushed out and then returned to the area. And then, European settlers that were there that were primarily hunting. There's not a lot of farming that could be going on because of the mountainous terrain. So a little bit of farming, a little bit of livestock, and a lot of hunting. But the same goes for the European subsistence cultures prior to enclosure. There were rules. Like, it wasn't a free-for-all. They understood, they were living close to the land. These were people that by financial standards would be considered impoverished, but they were wealthy because they were subsistence culture. So they understood that they couldn't, they would hunt things at certain times of the year, and they understood that there were limits on how they could do things. And that was just part of their life because they were living close enough to the land and in reciprocity to understand that. And, it was actually the lumber companies, the big lumber companies that were going up there, that were cutting down, larger amounts of trees and things like that. And the wealthy people that were going up there and hunting and privatizing land that were causing the trouble, for the most part. So we have to be really careful not to broad brush too much. And I know I can certainly be guilty of this. I try to be cognizant of it as much as possible, but to broad brush and just assume that, what's good or bad, or everything's one way or the other, it's all, all or nothing. There certainly was plenty, there were plenty of people that came here that were trying to do things in a sustainable fashion because they understood that that's what their subsistence depended on. So I just want to point that out, because that's something that I wasn't aware of until recently. And also to point out, whether we're talking about this or any other topic, we have to remember that illiterate people don't write the history books, right? So whether you are an indigenous person, who doesn't have our particular form of written language, whether you are, a person that was illiterate because of your social class or whatever, depending on where you came from or where you were in your life, if you did not write things down and you didn't have money and power, then your record is hard to find, if it exists at all. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do now, is get to the root of understanding the history from that opposite perspective, not just from the perspective of, the aristocrats, the white aristocrats that that basically manufactured a lot of the problems themselves to begin with, or were in cahoots with the people that did, and then were the saviors, and then wrote all about it. And it's the same classic tale, that we see over and over again. So that's where I am right now. I'm trying to understand things from that other perspective, and it's so hard because we don't have the records from those people. Yeah,
and it's interesting. Of course, like I said, this is a web, and you can enter it in any way, any point of it. And of course, the conversation around invasion biology, invasive plants, introduced plants, native plants is a piece to this as well. And so much of the information we're using to conserve land, to restore lands to a state that we consider better, more diverse, more healthy, or something, comes from, in some part, what we understand as like our idea of what an ecosystem was like pre-colonization. And yet what we have to determine that is very limited, actually. Because we're not listening to what the indigenous people's stories are about what the landscapes were and how they were and what they were doing to tend them and be in relationship to them. And then even if some of those indigenous peoples actually were willing to share those stories at this point, based on how many times they've been exploited for their knowledge or stories as well, it's like it's not like it was, if it has been listened to, those stories have been exploited. But often it's written down by people like, Lewis and Clark, or like the Fremont, like, people who were sent out ultimately onto the landscape to look for resource, and what could be exploited financially, and they were their expeditions are funded this way. And like people, and there's plenty of naturalists and botanists, this again, it's just so many pieces that can be woven into this, like the history of botany and anthropology is problematic too, but like, botanists going out, some of them really being just nature lovers, right? But also like still looking through a certain lens of like, this plant is what was written and said was being seen still through the lens often of this Eurocentric, ethnocentric kind of a way of understanding like what the people they encountered were doing and what they encountered on the landscape, what they thought they were seeing. And so we're basing so much in the present day on like past records that are incomplete, or are just one way of seeing, or are sometimes just straight up wrong.
Right.
We don't, like you said, we don't have the written, history is often told by the people who are in power, right? And then there's a lens in archaeology of not seeing things that aren't. This is another piece that I've been interested in and getting into, is like, and I talked to this archaeologist this winter in Arizona, actually, that I met randomly at a hot springs, about like archaeo-ecosystems and stuff. And she's like works for the tribes down there, and she's like telling me about, I think it was right before one of our classes actually, when I had just met her and was talking to her, and she was saying that like archaeology is changing so much too, because there's things that were ignored, right? This whole like shadow puppetry thing, there's things that were ignored because the people who were archaeologists in North America anyways were interested in commodifying relics of the past for museums, and both being known for it, usually white men, they're not always, but like relics to be put in museums and sold, and they looked and like felt a certain way, like pot pieces of pottery, or like arrowheads or whatever, things like that. But yet other parts of what it means to look out on the landscape and look at the past through the living pieces that are still there, like through these like objects that are still there, things are totally ignored that just didn't fit into what were the goals of archaeology at that time, like fire rings. She kept saying like there's so many things like fire rings where people used to cook their food, day in and day out, and over deep time, like same fire ring being used. That kind of stuff was just totally ignored. Yet like when someone found a piece of pottery, that was what got paid attention to. And so we're also like writing history based on what was written by certain people and what their idea of that was, and also about indigenous people's cultures historically. Even in herbal medicine, it's so weird, like these records of like, these native people use this plant for hysteria, and you're like, well, what the heck does that mean? Like,
right.
You got a European person, probably like someone who's also trying to Christianize these people, writing about what they saw the people using plants for, and one thing, not even knowing if they were interpreting it right, or were really seeing what was actually happening, or if they just were imposing what they wanted to see on it, right?
Right.
And then
Yeah.
also like the same with like these artifacts and like what we want to see out of the artifacts and what things were prioritized at what time. And we're writing all this history and these ideas of baselines and what we think the land should be like or what we think the cultures were like and people's relationships with land was looking like, because in the past people's priorities were different, and yet we haven't gone back and been like, wait a minute, we need to reevaluate all those things if we're going to have an appropriate perspective. I mean, even going on a tour this spring of a cliff dwellings thing down in New Mexico, and I was like happy to see this. Like one of the park rangers was like, we actually know nothing about really what happened here. Most of these interpretations were things park rangers made up because this is what they wanted to believe was actually happening here, but we actually have no clue what this room was for. We have no clue how they built this thing. You know, these were all like made up based on fantasies. And that's not acknowledged often in ethnobotany and the conservation movement. And yeah, and that bleeds into whole like baselines as it relates to native biotica, native plant and introduced plant kind of conversations with it gets really complex, but it's all connected to this web and this circle like of pieces. And that's this thing like the shadow puppet of like really don't fully know what was, and is are we trying to restore it back to what was? Is that really actually what our greatest goal should be? And while we still have that capitalist lens thrown in, like, you know, so many people, so many lists of like this gets into like, you know, even United Plant Savers at Risk list. I really appreciate the work that United Plant Savers is doing, but a lot of their like work is about like having to deal with the fact that things are either overharvested for capitalism, landscapes are being detriment, like, you know, destroyed because of capitalism, and these plants are at risk. But also it's about the fact that a lot of these plants are in commerce. Right. And we're wanting to preserve them for the sake of the plants themselves. They're wanting to conserve for the sake of the plants themselves, but also like there's some element of like commodity woven into it of like, well, I don't know if I think that their whole goal is about commodity. I think they're trying to just deal with the fact that that's what's happening. But you know, I interned for them, so I know like the innards of some of it when I did the internship, and some of it was about this idea that invasive plants are taking over native plant populations and things like that too, and we need to like protect them. And you know, and I just like, I think this is again like putting the attention in the wrong place, and we really need to be deciding what we should actually be putting our precious energy towards in a rapidly changing world where like more and more things are getting things are happening so rapidly that like I feel like we're putting our attention in the wrong direction. I think what you said about like conservation needing to be kind of swipe clean and start it over is a good thought, because yeah, it's just sort of like hamster on a wheel kind of stuff happening instead of actually reevaluating what we should be doing. And anyway.
Right. Well, because the thing is that there's still, those things are still, like we talked about before, they're still present today, right? So the fact that we're starting to see a mild shift in the right direction, and I feel like this has been happening since the pandemic and since the George Floyd protests and things like that. Since around 2020, we're seeing a shift, which has been kind of mind-blowing for me to witness. But it's not, you know, we still have a long ways to go. And so we're acknowledging that these things exist in our society and we need to change them. But because, like you said, history was not written, you know, objectively. So either because, like you said, they, you know, a lot of these scientists and historians and stuff, that they were cherry picking and selecting things that would be beneficial to them, or that they wanted, you know, it was a romantic vision of what they wanted to project, or because we have very short memory. You know, we have a lot of issues with forgetting things really quickly. And so it's possible to just erase parts of our history and people just forget it happened. And that's exactly what happened with the eugenics movement. We just totally, I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't know anybody. I don't know any individual that's my age that was taught that in school, or like has a general understanding of what the eugenics movement was. And that was very a very, very short amount of time ago that happened. For some of us, that's in our grandparents' generation. So
Yeah,
I think that, it gets,
explain
huh?
can you explain what eugenics is to people who might not understand what that is? And then, yeah, like elaborate a little bit more. You're about to do this, but just like define eugenics a little bit and like how that's connected to
Yeah.
conservation. I remember having an older woman in my life when I was in college. She was telling me she like grew up poor white in Appalachia, that they tried to, you know, she had doctors try to sterilize her. And
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
was probably in the 80s even. So,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot to it. But yeah, maybe you could go into that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like, most people know about, the Third Reich, and they know about, Nazi Germany, and they know about the Holocaust. So there's an understanding of like that was the kind of the apex of the eugenics movement. But what people don't understand is that the eugenics movement started in the United States. I mean, it started in Europe because white supremacy started in Europe, but the eugenics movement, that particular movement started here. And Hitler and Nazi Germany, a lot of his ideas directly came from American eugenics. And when we talk about this idea of erasing history, and I'll get into what eugenics actually is, but when we talk about erasing history, I just want to lay this groundwork down right now. It's really important. Madison Grant was one of the most, he was probably the most influential characters in regards to American eugenics, scientific racism specifically, and the conservation movement. But nobody in conservation ever hears his name. He doesn't have his bust next to Teddy Roosevelt's, in the Natural History Museum, because we wanted to erase him. And there has been intentional erasure of his records, of his correspondences. He wasn't a really big figurehead. He didn't like public appearances. And so it was very easy to just erase him from the record. And that's what we've done. And that's why so few people understand, the connection between eugenics and conservation. So essentially eugenics is this idea of conservation of a race, right? So when I talk about the correlation of eugenics and conservation, they are the same thing. I mean, that it's really important to understand that they're not two separate issues. Eugenics is a branch of conservation. Eugenics is conservation, but of human beings. And when the desire was to make this a scientific thing, and there was a lot of different ways that was done, and convinced a lot of people that race science was legitimate. So essentially, it's this idea that there is a particular, not just white people, but a particular subset of white people. Because at this point in time, a lot of people that we think of as white today, like Irish, well, I don't know about Irish actually, maybe even Irish also, but I know Italians, and a variety of other different, what we consider to be white people today were not included in this, right? So we're talking about a very particular subset of white people that were referred to as Nordics. There was a few different terms that were thrown around. But in the American conservation, or I'm sorry, American eugenics, Nordics was the kind of agreed upon term that we came to, in this history. So the idea was that the Nordic race was superior, so that there was different races, and this was something that became a thing around the time. It was right after Darwinism, around the time that Darwin, he published his Origin of the Species. And then we start to see this this divergence of how we classify human beings, and a lot of discussion around survival of the fittest and all of that kind of stuff. And so it was born out of this idea that eugenics was born out of this idea that the Nordic race was superior, and that traits were heritable. So certain traits, so things like personality, not just physical traits like eye color and skin color and things like that, but personality and criminality and talent and different things like this were all heritable traits. And it was this competition of the nature versus nurture movement. So this idea that no matter how hard you worked or how your environment influenced you, that you could never change your standing. And the correlation between eugenics and the elite wealthy power figures is really important, because if you think about that, eugenicists, which this is, again, this is a movement that wasn't created by the lower middle class American people. These were patricians, so these were the wealthy bourgeoisie kind of class. And it was one of the reasons why eugenics, there were many different reasons why this happened. One of the reasons why this came about was because there was a lot of class warfare going on, and the lower class, working class people were starting to get a little bit of a foothold with some of their labor strikes and rioting and that kind of stuff. And so that, in addition with massive immigration and disease coming in, we see the upper class people, the aristocrats kind of losing a little bit of their power grip. So if you tell people that not only are you separating them into these different categories and telling people that one is superior than the other, you're creating division among lower classes, which destabilizes their movement. But also you're telling people that the people who are in charge are the white Nordics, that they will always be in charge because of their bloodline, because you can't break the bloodline, right? So that's that idea of heritability. So if you have bad genes, there's no hope for you. Okay, is essentially what they were saying. And so once again, so this came from, it was a product of social and class struggles at the time. It was a product of Darwinism. It also, there was a large discussion around, that Gregor Mendel's genetic inheritance theory was kind of revived at that point in time and kind of twisted to meet what, to support their ideas. So they had this theory that there was this thing called a germplasm that was passed down, and if you mixed, if you interbred with someone who was not of the Nordic race, then that whoever wasn't of that Nordic race, so that they would have the child would inherit those negative qualities. So there was a lot of fear that it was basically called, there was a fear of race extinction. So people who believed that they were Nordics, which we all know now, none of these races even actually exist, right? But they believed that they were Nordics. They were terrified, it was like apocalyptic in their mind. So as terrified as we are today of the mass extinction that's going on, and biodiversity and climate change, that's the level of absolute horror that these people were experiencing in terms of believing that their race was going to go extinct. So they believed that they were actually going extinct because of the melting pot that was happening in America. So so we see these policies going into, well, first they're trying to make it scientific, right? So we see these different types of studies that are being done. Some of them were well received right away, and some of them were not. But we started with things like measuring skulls and different body parts and things like that, measuring them. And they said if your skull was a certain shape, then you were of the Nordic race, and if you weren't, and then things start to morph into different types of sciences. So then we start seeing forget his first name, but Davenport was the guy who basically put this big conglomeration of statistics, of data together, trying to prove that criminality and personality traits were passed down. And so he gathered all of this information, put it together, and got a lot of clout for that. And so so all of these different forms of scientific racism were beginning to pop up all over the place. And it became mainstream. So when I say mainstream, it wasn't mainstream among like the average person, it was mainstream among all of the elites. So we're talking about like political elites, economic elites, all of the founding members and professors and presidents and stuff of Ivy League colleges, of science organizations, all of that kind of stuff. Everyone was like 90% of the population of that particular subset of population was in agreement. And so the American eugenics movement was in effect a way to get the average person on board. So how do we get this to trickle down to to the average American citizen, so that they can understand this major problem that we have going on, and so we can fix it. And so there was a couple different ideas about how to fix it. We have positive and negative eugenics. So positive eugenics was more about promoting people to, promoting segregation. So promoting people that were Nordics to breed with Nordics and have lots of kids. And if you weren't Nordic, that, to segregate them and to, kind of prevent them from kind of taking over. And then you have negative eugenics, where we're actually talking about things like sterilization and euthanasia and things like that. So yeah, I mean, that resulted in a wide range of policies. So we had immigration restriction, which took a little while for that to get a grip, but they were able to eventually pass major immigration restriction laws. And once again, so we're talking about not just restriction against all non-white people, but anyone that wasn't of this particular Northern European Nordic this fictional race. So restrictions against Irish, against Italian, against Asian, Japanese, Chinese people, all Middle Eastern, Syrian, against all of these people, and particularly against Jewish people as well. That was one of the major. If you read the accounts of any of these eugenicists, it seems like more than anything else, they were concerned about Jewish immigration, and had some really horrific things to say about them. And then also, obviously, there were policies put into place internally as well against Black Native Americans and Latinx people. So all across the board, we're just seeing this so that we have the immigration restriction. We have prohibition of marriage. So if you had a mental or physical defect, or mixed race marriages, and that was there were some laws put into place banning that. And then forced sterilization. So obviously forced sterilization was mostly performed on women, but it was performed on both men and women. And it was first, I think it was Indiana. I think it was like 1907 or 1908 was the first year that Indiana was the first state to put a law into effect that was that mandated sterilization for criminals, for rapists, and like the mentally like disabled people. At that point they would have been called like imbeciles and things like that. So they put this law into effect and sterilized like tens of thousands of people. And those laws were not repealed until I think the 1980s, but they were still sterilizing people up until the early 2000s, people that were in prison specifically. And then obviously there's still today there's sterilization, forced covert sterilization going on in indigenous communities, and Black women, and in I actually don't know the statistics to know if it's still going on in prisons today, but I would not be surprised if it still is. So lots of forced sterilization that happened. And then also denial of sterilization and birth control for upper class women, because they wanted those women to proliferate. And then other general segregation laws went into effect. So keeping people separate from each other in the workplace and things like that. In addition to, we're talking about like in addition to Jim Crow kind of stuff. This is like, then kind of the next phase of that, but it's kind of coming from a slightly different place. Same general place, but different kind of era, right? And then euthanasia. So I think so many of us don't understand, I never learned this until very recently, right? That we think of the Holocaust as being like the worst of the worst because they were actually murdering people, but we did that here. We just did it covertly. So it was primarily medical neglect and, where they were basically like not feeding, like mentally disabled people, they would just not feed them, or, killing infants, things like that. But essentially there were studies, like I think it was the Carnegie did a study that was basically trying to figure out how do we, what are the negative eugenics methods that we can use? And gas chambers were one of them that was discussed in this paper that was released. But they determined that it wouldn't be well received by the American people, and so they opted out. And then, the same kind of movement is starting to take foot in Germany, and actually all other parts of Europe as well. And the success of eugenics policies in specifically the sterilization policy. There was one particular case of a young woman that was sterilized. Forget which state that was in, but anyway, so the success in the court system here and in our policies of forced sterilization was really what gave Nazi Germany its foothold. It kind of inspired them, like, okay, this is being successful. So they took it the next step, and it wasn't science that disproved eugenics. One of the things that bothers me the most about I'm a total science nerd. I love science. I love reading scientific journals. If I could go back to college, I would go back and become a scientist. I adore science, but I also very much recognize and acknowledge the blind spots that science can have. And I think studying eugenics has given me a really good understanding of how gaping some of those blind spots can be, because it was not science that kind of disproved eugenics. It was sentimentality. It was morality. So essentially what happened was the Holocaust began and took things a little bit too far. And that was because up until that point, in the United States, the people of the United States were on board. I mean, the ruling class, right? They were on board with what Germany was doing. We were all high-fiving each other up until the point where things just got taken a little bit too far. And then we decided, okay, the American people were appalled at what was happening. And that little bit of social change where it was that moral social change that instigated that was enough for the suppressed scientists who were the geneticists, were able to get their voice out and say, no, we actually have been refuting the science of eugenics, and y'all just haven't been listening to us. And so that they were able to then get a foothold and basically disprove eugenics scientifically, but that was not the first step. And so, like, when we talk about that the invasive plant discussion, one of the things that I see is this hard push against sentimentality, that it's dangerous and that we need to be objective and be scientific about things, and that we can't be sentimental about plants, even if it means killing them or whatever. And if you're in kinship mind, right, if you're in the mindset that plants are people and you acknowledge them as a living being that you are in kinship with, then I don't understand this push against sentimentality, because we can see here how science is 100% can be affected and twisted to reflect and benefit, different parties based on social, climate, economic climate. It can absolutely be twisted, and we know this. I mean, we know there's bad science that happens all the time, and the people of the early, the late 19th century and early 20th century accepted that this was considered to be, eugenic science was considered to be like the most scholarly, well-performed, it was applauded as being such wonderful science for many years, for decades, until morality kicked in, and we said, well, this is what eugenics looks like if it succeeds. So it succeeded, until it was eventually stopped, but it succeeded in Germany, and we saw the end product, and people realized how ugly it actually was, and that's what changed their mind. And so, when we talk about eugenics and conservation and those parallels, so Madison Grant was the character who put all of the kind of, he was a very, very intelligent person who managed to put all of this stuff together in this sneaky kind of way to convince people that scientific racism was valid. He was able to pull strings. He was from what I've read about his personality, like, people really liked him a lot. He made a lot of connections with a lot of really powerful people, and he was well spoken. And so he was able to kind of pull those strings, and then he put all of this together in the book that he wrote, which was that was the book that Hitler called his Bible, which was called, it's actually not coming to me right now, something about the master race. That'll come to me in a minute. Anyway, but Madison Grant was also one of the founders of conservation. And so you see these parallels, these overlaps. So like the 3 tenets of conservation that Madison Grant outlined were typology, deterioration, and invasive species. So typology was this idea that there's an ideal type for the species. So if we're talking about wildlife, because his big focus was on wildlife for at the beginning of his career, at least, we're talking about that there is a particular type of that species that is more resilient, that's stronger, has better genetics. And he just applied that to human beings, right? And then we have deterioration. So this is this idea that there are different factors that will degenerate that particular species, whether it's from improper management or from inbreeding. So once again, he basically took his zoology education and ideas and applied them to human beings. And then this idea of invasive species, which is that foreigners are going to come in and invade and cause that deterioration, and one of the major culprits of that. So one of the things that I appreciate about Madison Grant is that he and a lot of the eugenicists of the time is that they did not differentiate humans as being something more than animals. They were actually, a lot of them were actually fighting back against that Christian mentality that we were superior to other mammals. So that's something that, reading that, I was like, oh no, I resonate with something that Madison Grant said, but that made me even more so want to lean in and say, okay, so these are aspects, there are aspects to these conversations that, it's once again, not everything is always all black and white. So how did he take this and twist this into some really evil thing, and trying to understand that instead of just kind of freaking out and being like, okay, I don't even want to keep trying to understand this information. So anyway, so those 3 tenets of conservation he applied to human beings, and we see that pattern over and over and over and over again. The way that we communicate and talk, the language that we use, we talk about you know, invasive species is one of the major conversations and concerns in conservation right now. And, you know, if we think about the way that we talk about those members of a landscape as being they're called invasive species, they're invaders, they're aliens, they're thugs, weeds. Those are it's the exact mindset that white supremacists were using in reference to immigrants that were not, you know, not Nordics. It's like word for word. I have some like quotes somewhere, I can pull them up, of people talking about, you know, it's like if you compare the people talking about, or you know, just look at these statements of people talking about immigrants and you know, non-Nordic people, and then you look at people talking about non-native plants, like you almost wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Like you wouldn't know who they were talking about. And to me, that's highly disturbing. And so this is one of the many reasons why that this invasive species conversation comes up for me so frequently. And it's such an important thing for me, topic for me that I you know, I dive into with a lot of my students and talk about a lot, because for me, it's like the big red flag that's like waving, that's like, hey, yeah, this stuff is still alive and well in our modern perceptions and our modern, you know, ways of doing things. So yeah, the overlap there is like I said, it's not just an overlap. It's the eugenics movement is a branch of the conservation movement with all of the same founding members. I mean, if you look at the roster list of the Boone and Crockett Club and the American Eugenics Society, it's like, you know, it's all the same people. So yeah, I don't know if you have any other questions about eugenics specifically. I can dive into that a little bit more, but yeah.
Thanks for laying it out in that way, because just really laying out some of that history as it's all connected. You had sent me in an email the name of a book. I think it was the one you were trying to think of the name of, Defending the Master Race. Was that the name of the book?
So that is the book by Jonathan Spiro, who that's like the only book that I have ever been able to find that talks about Madison Grant. So he's talking about the book that that Madison Grant wrote, which let me pull it up right here. I'm sure I have it written down. Yeah, The Passing of the Great Race is the name of the book that Madison Grant wrote. So that book that I sent you that's Jonathan Spiro's book, and that is like a book that it's not in print anymore. You can find it you can get like a digital version of it. I think that every person in the United States should read that book, but at the very least, anyone who's involved in the conservation movement needs to read that book to understand the far-reaching impacts. You know, he doesn't necessarily connect all the dots as far as the overlap. He just kind of lays them out and kind of lets you do with it what you will. But a phenomenal biography of Madison Grant that I think it's just so important people read that book. And just in general, educate yourself about eugenics. And there's so many lessons to be learned from understanding what happened and how it's still affecting us today. Like it kind of blows my mind sometimes. I'll be reading something or trying to wrap my head around something, and then I'm just like, like right there it is, you know, it makes so much sense. There's just so many different aspects. But yeah.
You've definitely done your research. And Gabe and I, when we were doing the podcast together a few years ago, we did an episode that has been one of the most popular ones on the podcast, kind of digging into what we call the negative sides of conservation, but we barely dipped into some of this. And this is like the direction we were headed with it, like uncovering a lot of this stuff, the connection between the conversation around invasion biology and the history of conservation and the loss of the commons in Europe, and the witch hunts and the intersections of capitalism, patriarchy, all these things. But like, we didn't get this deep into it, and I'm really glad we're doing this conversation, because I think I've been wanting to dig further in, but again, like
what I've encountered and you have encountered, I know the pushback in well-meaning conservation mainstream culture towards having these conversations, because people have such a like binary view around all of it. Like, it's, if you question the basis of like the conversation around invasion biology, then you must hate native plants, or like if you question
Right.
basis of conservation, then you must not care about conserving the land. And that's not what's happening when we talk about these things, but that's like what comes up in that highly emotional, intense, attacking energy like comes up really strongly. And I've been willing to have a lot of these conversations on the podcast, but it's also like been really, really stressful sometimes. Like, even this past spring, I usually don't get into arguments online about any of these things, like especially on Facebook or Instagram, but you were there, you know what I'm talking about. You're
Yeah,
there. I said something to someone who has a big Instagram following, a big following overall, who I think has obviously a lot of well-meaning content, educational content around plants, but also did some posts about like hating, particular so-called invasive plants. And I was kind of appalled by like that hate, this is to this conversation around eugenics too, like that's that fierce hate behind the whole thing. And when I brought some stuff up, like, hey, like we should just ask ourselves whether it's appropriate to actually hate any plant, and try to bring up some history around invasive plant stuff, but it's like barking into a big or a big chamber, not echo chamber, but a big chamber of like madness, sometimes trying to speak up about these things. A lot of people who don't really haven't educated themselves, like, but have this lingo and this sort of tribalism around what they think is going on, kind of coming in and like attacking. Some people were like, oh, you think plants are sentimental, like so many people attacked me over like, well, I said sentient, actually, like sentience, which is interesting because like plenty of people appreciate Robert Walkemmer, right, as like a scientist and a scholar who's speaking to animism and science being able to be together in some way. And like, how is it that people could actually think that plants aren't sentient? That's what I think. Like, what are they then? If they're not sentient, what are they? They just that they're objects, right? That's still playing into that. And a lot of people were like, like, this is the greatest harm there is. It's like the fact that these plants exist and they're doing these things. And like, right, it's the same fear that you were saying around like the Nordic race piece, right. And like this idea that there's this huge threat towards purity of landscape, just like there was a huge threat towards purity of like a particular race that was dying or something. We're going to lose these pure landscapes. But when you really think about it, we're creating, just like you said, this purity that wasn't ever really there in the first place. And and it's just disturbing how many, we say leftists or something, but like people who are into like advocating for so-called nature or connection to landscapes being on board with this way of this line of thinking and jumping on the bandwagon of it. And like, if you question it in any way, or you bring up any nuance or anything that entertains a gray area, you're automatically on the other side. And it's been hard to know how to have these conversations. And that's why one of the reasons why I wanted to get you on the podcast too, because I feel like you have just such a good way of articulating how all these things are connected, that I think, just like how Matt Chu, when we had Matt Chu on, like, I'm just like, you know what, listen to the people that really know what they're talking about. And like how they're, like, I think there's no way to deny this connection once you really like break it down and look at it. And and I don't know, like, how to know what the right thing is to say, and in trying to shift this, like, how do you wake people up to like the reality that this is a piece to this whole thing, and like, and how it is a big problem in this sort of like, we're trying to restore landscapes, we're trying to fix harm done, but like, are we harming more in the process of trying to fix supposed harm done? And it's like, if we're not talking about these core pieces, then what are we really doing? And my friend Nikki, who's been on the podcast a bunch of times, and talking about invasion biology a little bit, she often has really like good ways of speaking to and articulating stuff about this topic, but I'm still trying to suss out for myself like what how do you actually get to people's more, like, get past the
Yeah,
tribalism and the lingo that people are just reciting, and in this highly emotional, fearful state about like this idea of these, what's a good landscape in this way. How do you get past that?
right.
Because so many of these people aren't educated about the reality of it. You know, people are just listening to someone who's influential, or like just have the surface level like thing, and yeah, aren't looking deeper in. And it's, and even people who are people of color, right? Like being on
Right,
board
right.
this very thing that's also been a problem for people of color in the very first
Mhm,
place, which is the irony behind it, you know. Um,
mhm.
all,
Well, I
but
think the thing is that people who are resistant to, well, so first of all, when I bring this topic up, I get a lot more positive response in person than I do online, which is not a surprise. But when I bring this topic up, I find one of two things happens. Either people are so relieved that they don't have to hate anything that they've been taught to hate. You can just see like this burden lifted off their shoulders. We're like, oh, you mean I don't have to hate honeysuckle? I don't have to hate, you know, Japanese knotweed. I don't have to actually hate it. I can just be with it. It's like that. It's mind blowing. Every time I see it, I'm just like, yes, you've been conditioned, you've been told, taught that you have to hate something. And anytime you're taught to hate something, you need to really look into that, right? Or, and again, this happens more often online, people will lean into that. They'll lean into the hatred. And I feel like there are some people who haven't worked out their shit, you know, that feel the need to have a scapegoat. You know, they feel the need to lean into that hatred, and both of those types of people, both of those instances come from the same root. It's that we're being taught to hate other beings, whether they're people or plants or whatever. It's just that some of us haven't, we're not to the point where we're ready to let go. So I see that happening a lot. So a lot of it comes down to showing people where that comes from. Like, why, like, let's just question for a minute why we're being told to hate something. It's one thing to want to make changes or to be concerned. It's another thing to have actual hatred toward another living being. Okay, so that's, I think that's a big, that it is often very helpful for people who are resistant to like, just let's just have some you know, introspection for a moment. The other thing too is that people who are very resistant to this topic are ones who are very concerned about, you know, biodiversity and the decline of the deterioration, right? The decline of ecosystems. And that's a very valid concern because we're seeing it, right? We can see that happen. It's scientifically, but now also right in front of our own eyes. If we're spending any time out in nature, you know, outside, you know, out of doors, then we are seeing the change. We can smell it. We can smell it in the air. We can see it in the sky. I mean, we've had these air quality warnings, you know, all the past, like, it's been like a month or over a month now of these air quality warnings from the forest fires. We're seeing, we can actually, it's palpable now, where it wasn't always necessarily before. And people who, like, like a lot of the like native plant purists and stuff, you know, in this area, there are people who spend a lot of time outside and they're seeing this degradation and they're scared, and they have every right to be scared. The question that I have, and I have a lot of questions. I actually wrote down a list of questions of things I don't have the answers to, all of these things yet. But the question that I have, one of the many, is, you know, first of all, if we're talking about these plants being a destructive force. So, you know, if that's actually true, then it's kind of one of the questions is like, how do we deal with that, right? So we're at war with these plants, and we're finding out that it's not very effective. You know, it's not, our war with them is not very effective. We're causing a lot of damage for not a lot of benefit. But even if we agree on that and say these plants are currently destructive, and I don't agree with that a vast majority of the time. If we just say we'll just lay that down and say that's the case, okay? Why? Why are they so destructive? So one of the reasons why we perceive them as being destructive is because of the landscape that we have altered. We have altered the landscape in a way that these post-Columbian species can thrive, and our native species, our pre-Columbian species, are not thriving. We have completely altered the landscape in a way that is not conducive to the landscape that we want to see. And we've talked already about like what that means and what our baseline is, and if that's, you know, valid or accurate. But, you know, so we've got this idea that that it's the invasive species that are causing the problem. You know, there's an understanding that there's other factors, but do people understand the catastrophic level of these other factors? And so, you know, there's two facets to that I always get like people to think about. One is, even if you believe that invasive species, I call them catalyst species, because it's when I hear the term invasive species now, I feel like I'm hearing a racial slur. Like I'm to that point where it makes my skin crawl. So trying to come up with different terminology that is not that way. So a catalyst species, so a species that's going to come in and create major change or respond to major change. So if that species is causing change, which we might perceive as being damaging to an ecosystem, you know, what has allowed that plant to thrive? And oftentimes we go, oh, well, it's that plant hasn't co-adapted and co-evolved with the other species that are in that area. It doesn't have any natural predators. And sometimes that's true, sometimes it isn't true. Sometimes we jump to conclusions and there's a media frenzy, kind of like what happened with the spotted lanternfly. But the thing to consider is like the absolute catastrophic level of damage that we have caused and are continuing to cause, not the plants, right? Us human beings, causing to the planet every single day, and we're not stopping. So, you know, if we're going to stop this catastrophic change, imagine if all of the emotions and energy and finances that we throw into this war against these plants, if we put that energy somewhere else, into the actual problems, into the pollution and the eutrophication of our streams, of improper fire management, of industrial agriculture, of capitalism, of dams, of all of these different ways that we're affecting the land and the water and the air. If we put our energy towards that, we might actually be able to make a dent in things. So that is one thing that I like to just have people consider. And then the other thing is, you know, we think of these things as, if we're still on this agreement that these plants are causing damage, how long will that last, right? So every plant that you see, unless you live in the ocean, every plant that you see around you is an introduced species. It has not always been there. At one point in time, it was somewhere else, or it evolved from something else in that environment. Every single plant is novel. It was at one point in time, and evolved, and it co-evolved with the species that are around it, whether they were plants or insects or humans or whatever. And so there is a timeline for that. And the timeline is different for each plant depending on what pressures are put on it, and you know where it's living, you know, where it lives. So we as human beings, we're only around for 80 to 100 years at the most. And so for us, it's like this big fear of, we're seeing these rapid changes. So we have this pressure of like, we need to see rapid progress, but we're not seeing it. And it's scary. But we also have this idea, because we have very short lifespans and very, short attention spans, that things are going to happen overnight. And with some plants, we're seeing that. With some animals, we're seeing that. We're seeing these rapid evolutionary adaptations, and some things are going to take longer. And that's another really important point, is that I always assumed that coevolution takes forever, takes hundreds, thousands, probably more like millions of years, right? We think about like, how long did it take for, flowering plants to evolve? very, very long time, right? But the reality is that throughout history, there's been long periods, like thousands or even millions of years in some cases, of low pressure. And then we have this high pressure thing that happens. Either it's a climate change, or there's a, different species that are evolving that are putting pressures on things, or, a natural disaster, catastrophe or something that, changes the earth, that changes that bioregion or whatever. And then we see a sudden, we have these sudden bursts of evolution that we see. And so we assume that all this stuff took forever, and the timeline of all these species ever co-evolving and adapting to their environment in a way that's symbiotic and sustainable, it's just too long. But the reality is that will probably happen very fast. And that's why I'm so fascinated by urban ecology, because we're seeing those things happen like within a couple of generations, like of like the insect or the animal or the plant, not of like human generations. We're seeing these massive changes, and some of them are evolutionary, some of them are adaptive. There's different things going on, but they are becoming community members in their ecology. And so we know that this stuff can happen more quickly than we think, but even if it's going to take a little bit more time, it will eventually happen. Every single catalyst species or invasive species or whatever it is that you want to call it will eventually adapt. I know Emma Maris. She wrote Rambunctious Garden. She also wrote this book, Wild Souls, which I was reading that book when we were in the class. And I've heard her talk about this before, but she outlined this in the book that I wanted to go over this, because I just think that this is, I don't know, once again, I don't have all the answers, but I think that this is something that has potential and we should be paying attention to it. So Emma Maris and Menno Shelthuysen, I think that's how you pronounce his name. He's the big urban evolutionary ecologist. He has some really interesting studies. So they're both kind of coming up with this idea. I think Emma maybe based some of these ideas off of Menno, I'm not sure. But she's calling it the boom and bust pattern, okay, with introduced species. So the first step is where it's spreading rapidly, and it's due to lack of predation, lack of pressure, right? So there's not a lot of pressure put on this plant. It's able to just propagate itself like crazy. But then what happens is that abundance incentivizes the other, species in the area to learn how to utilize it as a food source or whatever. So they're learning how to integrate that into their environment. Eventually, if there's enough predation, then you're going to see reproduction take a little bit of a hit. It's going to adapt again. And then the other species are going to adapt back. And we're going to see that happening back and forth, that adaptation from one aspect to another, from that introduced species to from the species around it, back and forth, until it becomes integrated and woven into the food web. And the reason why we know that this is possible is because it's happened to every species that's here today. And so her idea is that she's concerned that, like, if we are trying to control these species and eradicate them, that we're actually, she's called it, I think, like squelching the boom. So we're actually slowing the process by which these species can naturalize. And we're slowing we're impeding these co-evolutionary adaptations. Now, the concern here is that our species going to become extinct before, like, who's going to win that race? Are we going to see adaptation happen first, or are we going to see this massive extinction continue at a phenomenal rate? And which one is going to occur? And are the pressures, including the pressures of introduced species, going to put on these pre-Columbian species or sensitive species that are here? Are the pressures going to be too great, and are we going to see more extinction than positive turn? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I certainly know that the plants are not against us, right? They are not our enemy. They are not foreign invaders. They are filling a niche that we have created for them. And we are the ones that intentionally brought them here. So, the that question of like, well, what if extinction happens too rapidly, and then it's too late? So we're going to see biodiversity decline, and we're going to see destabilization of the ecosystem. The ecosystem is already really destabilized. Like, this is not a stable ecosystem. Things can continue to get worse from here, but a destabilized ecosystem will restabilize itself. That's what's so fascinating and incredible and mind-blowing about planet Earth, right? Is that it will unless we, detonate a bunch of atomic bombs, like it's that we're going to see even maybe then we're going to see a rebounding and a restabilization. It's going to look different than the one that we're in now. And I think the big question is, will humans be able to survive if we push things too far past extinction, push too many things into extinction and destabilize the environment to the point where we ourselves are at risk of extinction? And then also the question of like the concern over losing all these species. And we are going through a major grieving period where we are losing a lot of species, and it's really difficult to see. And I don't want to see it either. But again, it's not the plants coming in that are the enemy. It's the environment we are creating. We are 100% intentionally cultivating this catastrophic apocalyptic environment that we are living in. And we have to stop doing that. That is the solution. It's not about being at war with plants. It's about working in collaboration with them and understanding the deeper and more pervasive and more damaging things that we're doing and cycling it all back. We're doing that because we're living in a commodity, capitalist, imperialist, colonial system. And that is the reason why I constantly bring all of this stuff into I'm always talking about the invasive species issue, because it's like, let's put the scapegoat out on display and talk about it. Because if we continue to just pretend that this is like, this is what we should be focusing all our efforts on, we're going to not pay attention to everything else. And it's harder to talk about. It's a lot easier to complain about how these species are such a pain and how to get rid of them than it is to like dissect capitalist colonialism. Like so yeah. So I have my suspicions that what we're doing is counterproductive as far as how we're managing these species. And then I also have, like I said, I don't agree that a lot of these species are even damaging to begin with. We can look at the science behind some of these things, and some of it is of concern, and some of it is total media frenzy. Like, I know purple loosestrife is a really great example of that. It's considered one of the worst invasive species, like on the top 3 or 5 or something list of invasive species in the US. And there was a study put out by what was her name? I can find it here in a second. Basically, she illustrated that there was a little bit of research that was done, and then the media just took it and ran. And so we really need to be careful about if the science is even good before. And so if the science isn't even good and we're hating these things, then we're not any better than a eugenicist. And that is a very disturbing thing to consider. But it's definitely, it's hard to get people who aren't ready to hear this stuff to listen without being reactionary and responding with hatred. It's not an easy thing to do. I mean, I have, as I've gotten older, I have become a little bit more at peace with the fact that you can't change people until they're willing to change, until they're open to learning something. So that's, as a teacher, that's something that I'm constantly working on. But it's hard when you're out there and you're seeing the devastation to the planet, and you're seeing people they're blaming my friends. I mean, again, like you said, like Robin Wall Kimmerer was a bestseller now. I mean, people are on board and they're listening, and we're seeing this shift in consciousness that, like, well, yeah, plants are probably sentient, and like there's actual science now coming out to substantiate this, and it's good science, and we're slowly starting to embrace some of our ancestral, perspectives and indigenous perspectives about plants and other more than human relatives being sentient and having relationships with them. And I can't in good conscience call these plants my kin, call them my friends, and then advocate for their genocide. I don't care what people think they're doing to the environment. If these were my human friends, I would be doing the same thing. So yeah, I think that, it's hard work. It's really hard to find some of this information, to piece it all together, to understand it, to put aside the preconditioning that I have, and have had throughout my life from, whether it's my upbringing or social, cultural norms or whatever. It's not an easy thing to do. And it's certainly not an easy thing to do when we're in I really feel like we're living in a post-apocalyptic landscape. It's definitely not an easy thing to be doing, but we have to keep trying. And I feel like one of the things that I'm called to do is to show people that we're barking up the wrong tree. We really need to be putting our efforts into dismantling oppressive systems, and not warring with plants. To say it out loud, that almost sounds even silly to me. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about Matt Chu, you and I, in class, and my class, we had to read Matt Chu as one of the pieces, and we've had him on the podcast. I think you said you read like everything he's written, and I don't
know about everything, but I've read a lot. Yeah.
A lot. I mean, he's definitely doing the work of piecing together all the things, to try to like suss out what's really happened, and a lot of what he's illuminated in his research work. And yeah, folks in the audience, if you haven't listened to the episode we did with him a few years ago, it's a long one, but he lays it all out. And then, there's some articles you can find for free to read online of his and stuff too that are really pretty easy to read, I think, in my mind. But he's like a biologist and a historian, so he's laying out the history of kind of where this idea of invasion biology even came from. But he's putting together like a big just like, hey, really calling out science too, like what you're saying with the eugenics bit. Like, science is not unbiased. Science is really influenced by culture, while telling the world it's objective, and that's where it gets really tricky and becomes its own religion, And he's just illuminating, hey, the science isn't complete. Some of the science might have some legitimacy, some of it doesn't. Some of it needs to be repeated over and over. Like, there's a lot that's not happened to really verify anything. And even I think there was a piece just about, like, he wrote that just in itself was just like, hey, here's how science, the culture around this particular plant, say salt cedar or something, for example, is influenced the scientists themselves and their objectives that they claim are unbiased in their research, but really is biased, And so a lot of the times it's like, as a scientist trying to be taken seriously, getting your PhD or doing grad studies, like if you try to do research on something that isn't acceptable in the community of like what everyone wants to think about something at that time, then you won't necessarily be able to do your research and get your job and do the things, And so people are scared to like often challenge it, even within the realm of science. And he just lays it out like, here are the holes, here are the problems, here's how this got twisted at this point in time and turned into this thing. And I really appreciate the work he did during his career to lay it all out. And there's definitely a lot more to do. I feel like too, we should pull together a resource list for this episode, like, and put it in the show notes with a lot of these people that you've mentioned, just so people can, I know on your website you have some really good articles. We can link that too on this. You have a lot of really good articles that do have a big works cited kind of resource list in themselves. So kind of on some of these topics, like, but yeah, it's, I think, important for people to dig deeper before they jump to conclusions about these things. And just doing a plant walk it's not that simple. Just being
Yeah, I
teachers
know.
as we are, like teaching a plant walk is not that simple because it's all of these
Mhm.
things that come up and like,
Yeah.
and yeah, there's a lot to it.
Yeah, I think the important thing, to walk away with is just you have to keep asking questions, right? You can never just take things at face value. I mean, yes, like we have scientific facts, right? And we can move forward with them. But like we said, we're not always aware of blind spots. Like if you think about the way that we do any other study, whether it's like a study on medical studies, we have to take into consideration confounding factors. And I think that a lot of the science today, ecological science, doesn't take into account those confounding factors, where we're considering what are the other things at play that could be affecting our results. And so, like if we talk about, like, just as a kind of a metaphor, if we study a plant to see if it, like, let's say we're studying an herb to see if it's toxic, and we're studying it in a person, and that person dies. One of the things, after taking this plant, one of the things that we have to do is determine whether it was that plant that killed that person or not. And that's when we're talking about those confounding factors. What else is at play? And I think so few people have been educated about the confounding factors of ecology, and that's really problematic. And so that's the big thing when I teach my plant walks. And you're right, it's not an easy thing to do. It sounds so simple, but it's not. Is just ask yourself, and ask the plants, like, what is it that you're doing here? What services are you providing? How are you benefiting your surrounding? How are you affecting your surroundings? What are the ecological relationships that are occurring? How might things change in 6 months or 5 years or 100 years? How were things, what were things like before? We have to ask. There's so many questions that you have to ask before you can make a judgment. Like, we're so fast, we're so quick to make judgments about things and label things and put them into these boxes. And that is a product of a very sick, societal way of doing things. It's something that we need to work on getting out of. So yeah, just asking questions and spending a lot of time. I feel like just spending a lot of time with the plants is one of the ways that I mean, like I said, I love science. I love reading all the things. I love doing my research, but some of the most profound moments that I've had have been just sitting with the plants and considering them as a being, and then being like, I can't hate you. I mean, I did this with Japanese barberry. I hated that plant. I really did, because I was told to. And then one day I was like, I had been doing plant sits, and I was like, I'm going to sit with this plant and be like, what's your problem? Like kind of like accusatory. And I sat with that plant and I was like, this is just a plant. Like, this is just a plant, and you judged it. And I feel like that was a major turning point for me, of just like acknowledging this plant as a relative and as one of my community members, and deciding I don't have to hate it anymore. And that sent me down a rabbit hole. That actually might have been the moment that I got sent down this rabbit hole of just questioning that. So yeah, I just want to encourage people to do that as much as possible. You can do all the reading and do the research, and we'll definitely put together a resource list, for people to look into some of these topics. But a lot of it just comes from introspection and spending some time thinking about your social conditioning and where a lot of these oppressive mindsets have come from, and then working to grieve all of that and go through the emotions, and then trying to come out on the other side. So
Yeah, and sitting with the plants themselves, because they'll screaming at you like, hey, hold on now. Like,
yeah
totally.
I just always think they must just think that we are so short-sighted. But yeah,
Totally. Or they have things to share with us, and if we pay attention, like Japanese knotweed and Lyme's disease or something, if you want to think of that as a correlation, it's like, hey, pay attention to me. Or what do I have to do to make you pay attention to me?
Right. Yeah, I know. I think that is definitely something that is happening. I mean, that we're getting outside of the realm of science now and like being scientific about things, but I 100% believe that these plants that are so prolific and so resilient, like like our lanthus and Japanese knotweed, like they are the post-apocalyptic poster children. You know what I mean? Like they are the ones that are showing us how to survive and be resilient and to pay attention to their message. And instead we're hating on them. So I'm a big advocate for having people appreciate, it's very ethnocentric to only appreciate one form of knowledge and learning. And something that I try to cultivate, with my students as much as possible. And even in myself also obviously is gathering information and processing information and knowing things in multiple different ways and spending time cultivating different ways of doing that. And so, I'm a big advocate for having people sit with plants or with the birds or whatever calls to you,
Yeah. People can find you online. You have an Instagram.
Yeah.
And you have a website, and you are also doing a program soon. Is that something that's in person or online? I just saw it on your website earlier, and I wanted to make sure that people knew, because I'll get this episode out pretty soon, I think, so people will know that they can. Yeah, maybe you can tell people what your website, Instagram is, and then your education stuff coming up that the broader audience of people here could like tap into.
Sure. Yeah. So the website is northernappalachiaschool.com. And that's my handle also for Instagram. I have a program starting in 2 weeks, actually. That's my Foundations of Bioregional Herbalism program. And then I'm doing an herbal therapeutics program after that in the spring. But it's actually, so the program is actually full. It's actually been full for a little while. But I'm taking a wait list for folks for next year. So the bioregional program, it's an herbalism program, but we don't just focus on herbalism. We focus on a lot of, talking about bioregional living and ethics and social justice issues, like all the things that we're talking about today, ecology. And then obviously we dive into a lot of medicine making sciences and phytochemistry and botany and all of those fun things. And some of the traditional Western herbalism framework. So that's that program. And and I also, I do workshops, I do private classes, I run the whole gamut of things with that. And my partner, Jay, he teaches a variety of subjects that skills that complement mine and other skills, like he teaches wildlife tracking and things like that. We actually don't have any classes, like public classes, on the schedule yet for the remainder of the year. So just keep an eye on that. I always have you can sign up for the newsletter, and I send out, when there's another class posted. And then, I always have on my homepage, I have the list of the calendars on there if people want to keep track of what we're doing. I have some different resources and stuff on my website as well, and the blog is on there, and things like that. So definitely check it out. And I would love to get a class, like a plant walk or something, at least on the schedule for the fall. But things always get really busy when the program is running. So so that's where things are at right now, though.
Yeah, we'll link we'll put your website in the show notes too, in addition to everything, but maybe okay. Specifically an article or something too that you have, because you did a lot of research to write those. I was like, wow, this is very thought out. And I think it would be great if more people knew about it and could go on there and like see how you put it together too.
Yeah, that one. It's funny because I was actually working on a blog post on conservation and eugenics when we set up the last, the one that we canceled the last time that we were supposed to talk. And I've been working on this blog post, and I was like, oh, maybe I'll get this posted around the same time this goes up. And I'm working on it, and I'm like, I think this is a book, not a blog post. So we'll see. That might go up, or it might not. I might end up just taking that and sitting on it for a year or two and making a book out of it. But I'll send you I'll try to remember the things that I mentioned in the conversation. And if I think of any other, there's a couple other books that I would recommend, that I can send you the all the information for that. Also, just try to make a note. Trying to remember all the if I name dropped people today, but yeah, I'll send you some of that stuff for sure.
I wrote down some stuff as we were talking too, but
Okay,
as
great.
I edit, I'll write down more stuff. But yeah, I don't think, like you said, there's
Okay.
not a whole lot out there that really pulls us together in a way that's concisely digestible for people. It took you a lot of effort to find even what you did. So I think a book sounds like a good idea for sure.
Yeah, there's books on capitalism, there's books on eugenics, there's books on conservation. There's nothing that's really pulling it all together. Yeah. So, yep.
Well, thanks for hopping on. I'm glad we got to get it to work out, that my signal here in rural Colorado, 9,000 feet on the side of the road, worked out. Because I was like, at the beginning of it, I was like, we had a couple times where we lost each other, but this last hour or so, it's been pretty clear and good. So I'm happy it all turned out. Yeah, but thanks. I'm glad we got to get the time to do this. And,
I appreciate you having me on.
yeah.
Hey y'all, I really hope you like this conversation with Calyx Liddick of Northern Appalachia School out of Southern Pennsylvania. And before we end this episode and go into the last song by Bridget and Soren, just thought I would let you know that if you want to look into all the show notes and resources that we put together for this episode, you can find them on my website at ofsedansalt.com in their fullest state. You won't find them in their extensive fullest state on iTunes or in the show notes that you'll find through your platform, most likely, because they have a word limit. So go on to the website ofsedansalt.com to see everything, to explore the books and articles that we put in there if you want to dig deeper into some of the stuff yourself. Also, links to Bridget's Venmo, the musician's music who's on this episode, and my Venmo and PayPal and Substack. All those things are all in the show notes for this episode. So go there. Also, bookshop account where you can buy books for me or buy books for yourself and support local booksellers when you do. I'm going to add some of the books that I can find through Bookshop that we talked about in this episode there. So if you actually want to buy some of these, you could do it through the Bookshop account too. So that's all on the show notes as well. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please do email me if you have any thoughts or questions, insights. I am posting this on Substack as well, and that's a great place to have conversation about these topics. It's a really easy platform to make a comment and start a conversation. So go there as well if you want to have a public conversation and talk to other people about this. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy this last song as we roll out by Bridget Downey and with Soren on guitar. Bye, y'all.